Hi, I'm Ira.
And I'm Ari, and welcome to today's edition of the Irari Report. Today we're here talking to Inglis, former Deputy Director of the NSA.
We're going to be talking to Mr. Inglis specifically about Edward Snowden, the damage he caused, the potential international implications, as well as what companies can learn from Edward Snowden's transgressions and how to better secure their organizations. Okay, so as the former Deputy Director of NSA, you had to deal with the damage that Snowden caused. Now, the thing is that in the general public's mind, Snowden is perceived as a hero that just released information that the public has a right to know in theory. Now, the question is, that came with a lot of other material because it wasn't just the two programs that it makes it sound like. There were potentially 1 million plus documents that he released. That 1 million plus documents was not necessarily well filtered. And, he claims he went through it and all that sort of stuff. There were reports that there were potential deaths, that there was intelligence programs compromised. What was just at a high level description, can you start with the potential damage that was caused by the release of the documents?
So I like the framing of your question. I think it's the right question, which was Snowden careful and deliberate in exposing what he claimed to expose? And first I would distinguish between his allegations and the revelations that he purported to make. Much of what he said was an extrapolation of some core truth, and in many cases he got that exactly wrong. He was not the least bit careful about looking at the material that he released. He's admitted that since then, and he's gone so far as to say that he left it in the hands of the press to make a determination as to what was in the public interest to release or not release. As to the damage done, the damage was several things. First and foremost, he has revealed critical sources and methods to adversaries around the world, and not just of the United States, but of our allies, right? Our Five Eyes partnerships and those other nations that we collaborate with, how we actually hold adversaries at risk using intelligence sources and methods. Terrorists, rogue nations, weapons proliferators, they now have our playbook, and there has been some damage done in our ability to then understand what they're doing and our ability to provide decision makers of multiple governments with the information they need to keep us safe. The second damage that he did was to undermine the confidence that the American public, or governments plural, have in their foreign intelligence organizations, most of all the National Security Agency. And in that regard, again, most of what Snowden talked about was an extrapolation of some core truth, but in many cases got it exactly wrong. And that then creates reputational harm, which is really not the important issue, but the confidence that comes from that of the Congress or the American public of allowing NSA to continue to do what it does, because that mission at the end of the day is designed to help keep the nation safe. Nothing more, nothing less. The third harm was one of opportunity cost. We spent a lot of time in 2013, 2014 chasing these ghosts of stories, trying to actually correct the record, when instead we should have been doing our mission, should have been doing our job. And the harm that comes from that opportunity cost is not something you can reasonably quantify. I can't tell you how many untoward things happen because we took our eye off that ball, but I'm confident that it's something. The last thing I would say is that there's a damage to the psyche, the morale of the workforce that shows up at the National Security Agency every day. To their credit, they have continued to come in numbers. They never came for the swell parking, the great pay, right? The respect that they might hope for across a professional career. But to the extent that that's been weakened and damaged, it does something to the public service model that we tried to establish of, you want to do something great for your country, you want to have the confidence that that actually makes a difference. That's been weakened a bit. Not because they've lost confidence in themselves, but because you need to affirm and validate that from the outside. So that's what I would say about what Snowden's legacy is. It's not a good one.
So one of the problem statements here is that those affected by the media, people can identify with what it was that was disclosed and why Snowden disclosed it, and what the potential material benefit to the right to know is of U.S. citizens in understanding what he had disclosed. What the answer you've given is a little bit more vague, a little more difficult to quantify and identify with in terms of what he surrendered and what we lost as a result. How would you counter that? How would you respond to the right to know?
I think that's a great and fair question. I'd respond at two levels. First, we have to distinguish between what Snowden said and what was true. His allegations are not one and the same as revelations. Much of what he extrapolated from his information was frankly untrue. He said early on that any NSA analyst could, sitting at his or her desk, target the communications, the content of the communications of the President of the United States of America, quote unquote. Patently untrue. It's not only illegal to do such a thing, but there are procedural controls and technical controls in place that make that impossible. He said that the National Security Agency targeted the content of the communications of U.S. persons. That's not true. It is absolutely true that in targeting the content of legitimate foreign intelligence targets, that sometimes the other end of that conversation is a U.S. person, and it's almost impossible to determine that with great precision up front. But because of that, there are procedures in place of what exactly do you do when you encounter that situation. I would describe that as a feature, not as a burden, not as a sin. There have been no evidence since Snowden has come out that what he alleged is in fact true, that there have been any violations of law. The second way I would answer that is that the American public does have a right to know about the existence of the National Security Agency and the capabilities they bring to bear. But in the same way, they cannot know, because we can't tell 7 billion people precisely what material they turn up, because that's more appropriately given to those decision makers who the American public has elected and who stand in their shoes to drive the nation to whatever place we would go. And so, should they know that NSA is a foreign intelligence organization? Absolutely. Should they know what budget we bring to bear? Absolutely. Should they know what authorities we have? Absolutely. Should they know the content of the President's daily intelligence brief? That's the bridge too far. And so the compromise that we've struck 200 and some years ago is that we have a representative government. We have an executive branch that essentially is elected in place to represent the United States people, right? Not their own interests, not the interest of the elected representatives, but the people themselves, that at the end of the day make choices on their behalf. We have a legislative branch that essentially constructs the laws, delegates the authorities, and a judicial branch which holds all of them accountable under the Constitution, under the rule of law. That's a representative democracy that if I were to describe how we got where we were in terms of what NSA does and how it does that, it's the whole of government that does that. Now, I would tell you that greater transparency is an inherently good thing. And we've learned once again that you can't be too transparent in terms of satisfying the American public's curiosity and their need to understand that information. But there is a line, because at some point you're beginning to give your adversaries your playbook, and that's what we actually struggle with. We try to get that right day after day. I think we're in a better place because Mr. Snowden came out and said what he said. But it's as if I would give credit to the arsonist for a better house in the aftermath of that. I give no credit to Mr. Snowden. He was indiscriminate in the harm that he did. And the little bit that we have as an opportunity to improve what's left, we should embrace that, take advantage of that. That is a positive, silver lining in an otherwise dark chapter of our history.
Last year, or maybe I guess it was last year, we had at this conference Stephen Colbert, and he made a comment to the effect, well, first Snowden goes to China, then he goes to Russia, was Mordor not accepting asylum applications? Now, to that end, there's been thoughts and there's been speculation as to why Snowden did what he did. Frankly, the first place he goes to China, he said he was on his way to Argentina, and last time I looked at a map, Argentina was the exact opposite direction of China. So theoretically, it can be speculated that Snowden was an agent recruited by China. I've had other people who've said that Snowden was potentially recruited by Russia as well, because he did a lot to subvert U.S. relations with European countries and within the population. We spoke to Ray Semko, who's a former defense counterintelligence analyst. He just said that Snowden was a person who was pissed off, who didn't get the salary he wanted. And I guess with that in mind, with the news that Snowden also was fired from the CIA, or was under investigation from the CIA before he resigned, about speculation that he was trying to hack other people's emails and files, what is the formal belief of why Snowden did what he did? Was he acting as an agent of a foreign government, or was he self-recruited to just do what he did for whatever reason and found welcoming arms in the hands of China and then Russia?
First, I have to point out that I don't represent the United States government anymore. I'm no longer in an official capacity, and so I wouldn't know what the official position of the U.S. government is any more than I would know the absolute truth of what Snowden's thinking was and all the machinations that he went through to do what he did. But here's what I surmise based upon a careful observation of the facts available to me. It does seem clear that his intention was to go to Latin or South America after he revealed all this material in Hong Kong. He worked very hard, and his lawyers worked very hard on his behalf to actually achieve that in the days and weeks afterwards. It doesn't seem to me that a destination of China or Russia would be preferred. And his indiscriminate release of information tells me that he likely wasn't careful in the things that he sought to acquire and to release any more than he was careful in his plan for how he was going to escape. This was something that was done on the fly. It wasn't carefully thought through. I can't imagine that his plan A was to arrive in Moscow and essentially be in virtual isolation in a foreign country. It probably is a nice enough place to be, but it's not home. It's not the society that he claims that his principal affiliation is with. So I don't think that he was in the employ of the Chinese or the Russians. I don't see any evidence that would indicate that. And even if they're careful in terms of practicing denial and deception, I think there would be certain telltales in there that would work out more crisply, more cleanly, separate and apart from where he's wound up. In terms of what Snowden's rationale was, why he did this, I think it's very clear. He's an angry young man. He's very polished. He's very articulate. But the indiscriminate harm that he's levied on the United States and its allies around the world, and the intelligence means and methods that they bring to bear, speaks of someone who essentially has an internal rage, right? A rage that is sufficient that he wasn't careful. He wasn't the least bit discreet about the things that he purported he had an adherence to and his ability to then describe those. He said he was worried about the violation of U.S. person privacy. Most of the information he released has nothing to do with that. He said that he could prove that the United States violated U.S. person privacy beyond the reach of law, beyond the constitutional norms that are established. There's been no proof of that. Now, we as a matter of policy might decide that we're uncomfortable with collecting telephone metadata. That doesn't make it illegal. Bad policy or a different choice about policy doesn't make it illegal or unconstitutional. And in the country that I was raised in, the same country that Mr. Snowden was raised in, we have a system of laws that say we're all bound by those laws. We cannot take the law into our own hands, become vigilantes, and essentially exercise that judicial jurisprudence as a nation of one. So my sense is that Mr. Snowden, for whatever reason, was trying to get even, trying to get mad. He did that. He was indiscriminate in that. He's now left with the pieces of his life in a faraway place, trying to figure out how he comes back.
So when I was an NSA employee, in theory, I couldn't spit without hitting something that involved Russia or China. That's not a secret. However, Snowden has released 1 million documents supposedly saying I took everything of relevance that might impact domestic surveillance and everything like that. Russia and China arguably have domestic surveillance efforts that put the whole whatever he disclosed to shame. I have yet to see a document released about Russia or China's domestic surveillance efforts. Do you have a comment on why that might be, or is it possible Russia and China are withholding the information and he purposely withheld that information so as not to antagonize his hosts?
Like you, I do find it curious that Snowden, who is now kind of in the protective embrace of Russia and who once enjoyed the protective embrace of China, has said nothing about those legal regimes, which most independent observers would say runs roughshod over civil liberties, human rights. I find it curious he would not say a word about that. But it's consistent, actually, with what he said while he was in the United States. Nothing. He made no complaint to anyone about what he now observes, what's in his view, a violation of U.S. person privacy. He said nary a word the whole time he was at the National Security Agency, nary a word the whole time he was with the CIA. When asked about that by Jim Bamford, I believe 2 years ago, the spring of 2014, he said he had at one time raised a question to an NSA lawyer. When we went back and took a look at that, it turns out the question that he asked was, are the priorities that were kind of articulated to me in a class that I took on the protection of U.S. person privacies, the U.S. Constitution, an equal priority between law and executive order, and then policies, regulations, and the like. Lawyer came back same day answering that question from Mr. Snowden and saying, no, that's not exactly right. Turns out that a statute, a law, trumps an executive order. They're only on the same line in the priorities table because in the absence of a law, an executive order stands in. If that's a complaint about the protection of U.S. person privacy in the United States of America, I'm hard-pressed to see it. I'm hard-pressed to understand it. Having raised not one question about that issue while he was here in the United States, My assumption is that Snowden doesn't have the courage of his convictions when he thinks he might be held personally accountable for standing up and defending those convictions. It's not an official position, but that's how I feel.
So we've talked a lot in the course of this interview about careful deliberation, about predictability and general motivation, about outside entities that could have influenced their internal desires and drivers to turn around and make decisions about what information to gather and disclose. An organization like the NSA that was quite prepared intellectually, psychologically, culturally for the notion of insider threat. If that organization was compromised despite the threat actor behaviors.
It's a great question.
What can be learned by enterprise organizations in trying to address the insider threat, especially the truly rogue entity who defies all logic and
it's a great question. It's a great question. I mean, the question essentially devolves to, did NSA perhaps not give enough credence, not give enough consideration to the insider threat, the possible existence of an Edward Snowden? And what then are the lessons, if we've got an answer for that question, for other enterprise organizations that essentially have insiders that they extend trust to? When it's all said and done, I think the notion of security, perfect security in the world, whether it's physical security or cyber security, is an impossibility because of two things. One, these systems are inherently dynamic. People are involved. They're inherently going to make different choices under different circumstances, and they're not always predictable. That said, you can't be complacent about that. And so then there's this notion of trust. You allocate responsibility not just to pieces of technology, but to people, that they will make thoughtful choices, that they will exercise discretion, initiative, creativity. Where does most of the competitive advantage of a modern age company comes from? It comes from that very ability. And so what you do at a place like NSA or a place like outside organizations is you try to find people to whom you can extend that trust, in whom that trust will be well placed. You try to make sure that you kind of trust and verify, but if the verification is too tight, too constrained, what you get is that no one can move. No one can kind of essentially do anything that exercises creativity, innovation, which is the lifeblood of an organization like NSA. Not creative with respect to the interpretation of the law, but creative about how do you chase adversaries in a space where the adversary often enjoys the advantage, often has the audacity of the initiative. So the law is always sacrosanct. That's never at question. It's how you actually chase an adversary in that space. We extend trust to people at the National Security Agency. We go to an extraordinary amount of time and trouble to find people that we think we can do that to. And every once in a while, every once in a great while, one of them will break your heart, like Edward Snowden. I would say that he's likely one in 250,000. That's not a bad track record, but it turns out that one can do enormous damage, and he did. What then? Do we then say to everyone else that we don't trust them? We have to continue to trust them. They show up at the National Security Agency like they show up at companies for something more than the salary, something more than the swell parking, something more than the buildings they work in. They want to aspire to do something noble. They want their collective actions to make a difference for their nation. We need to continue to trust them. We will increase the verification, and we'll do that with their full knowledge so that they know that we're protecting their equity and in turn the equity of the nation that depends upon their services on a daily basis. We're never going to be perfect at that. There may likely be another mistake that we make because we're not omniscient in our understanding of what somebody might do on some given day. They cross the yellow line on a two-way street and all of a sudden they're coming at you head on. That's the risk we take when we actually involve the degree of trust that we do. And I think, for one, I like living in a country where we extend trust and we therefore have some sense that there's a bit of a risk here, and I trust that my person to the right of me, to the left of me, is going to actually operate for my better interest, for the nation's better interest. I'd rather live there, being somewhat optimistic about that proposition, than to shut down and micromanage and control every living person in the place. We can be smart about that. We need to be smarter about that. We'll never be perfect.
Given the damage Snowden caused, what have been the lessons learned out of this incident? Because obviously NSA has had to, I'm hoping NSA did a post-mortem on this and everything like that. What are lessons, because now you're working with Secure Onyx and the Board of Advisors and everything like that, right, and they are doing behavioral analysis type of work along with other companies like DTEX and things like that. What are the lessons learned beyond, I'm assuming beyond behavioral analytic work? What can you tell, what did you learn from NSA that you can also apply to other viewers who work in large organizations in securing and looking for insider threats?
At the highest level, I think there are three lessons. One, don't underestimate the probability that you've got an insider threat. probability in our case at the National Security Agency was 1, right? 1 out of 250,000 is 1. 2, don't underestimate the consequences of that. Consequences are not simply the loss of intellectual property, which you might recover in an afternoon or buy down because you've got an insurance policy. It's the reputational harm, it's the confidence, in our case, of the American public and the elected representatives in NSA. It's the opportunity cost of having to chase those ghosts and put all that back together again. And 3, the lesson is, having kind of understood the probability and the consequences, invest accordingly. I would say at the National Security Agency, where I no longer serve, it's very likely that there's a higher priority given to that and more time and attention given to that. But at the same time, we can't lose our eye on the ball of an outsider threat or perhaps an architecture that isn't necessarily constructed to do precisely what you want. Turns out if you think about security in a slightly different way, you can actually get a leg up, you can kind of begin to solve all 3 of those problems at once, because all of those devolve to one thing: the exercise of privilege against data inside your system. And if you can come up with security strategies and technologies that support that, you then can begin to understand behaviors in real time inside your system. And in understanding that, you can see anomalies in the context of themselves as they occur. Not based upon some a priori knowledge, not based upon I suffered it once, I'll now catch it the second time, but because I can see this in the context of itself as being something that is not right, it's not normal, it's not ordinary. In so doing, you need to not just bring to bear technology, but there need to be procedures that go with that, and you need to be very, very clear with the workforce about what it is you're doing, so that they understand the degree to which their privacy now is at some greater risk, and they understand the reason for that, and they then consent to that. They don't need to consent to that, they can then choose to not operate under such a condition, but I think if you're clear about that up front, they can get to a place where they say, I'm comfortable about that, and I understand to what degree that's necessary and to what degree that's constrained. I think if you do that, you can then create a defensible proposition that protects yourself adequately against outsider threat, insider threat, or devices that simply might not be doing what you want them to do. And you can do that under a single security strategy and the technologies and procedures that are consistent with that.